Let's talk about trailing commas in Python. Whenever I make a multi-line list, dictionary, tuple, or function call, I prefer to put the closing bracket or brace on its own line. I also usually prefer to put each element on its own line with a comma after each one, including the last element. This is called a trailing comma, and it's not necessary in Python, but it can be helpful. Let's say we have a dictionary that doesn't use a trailing comma. So we have each element on its own line, but the last one doesn't have a comma after it. If we wanted to swap pears and bananas in this dictionary, we would need to be careful to make sure that we add a comma after bananas, because it's now in the middle of this dictionary, so this would be a syntax error if there wasn't a comma. But for consistency's sake, we should also remove the comma at the end, because we're trying to not use trailing commas here. If instead we purposely were using trailing commas, we would just swap pears and bananas and call it a day. We're done at this point. So trailing commas can be helpful when swapping elements in a data structure, but they can also be helpful when adding new lines. So if we were to add an element in the middle, we would always put a comma at the end. But if we added an element at the end, if we weren't using trailing commas, we shouldn't put a comma at the end. But we also need to worry about the line just before ours, the previously last line. It needs a comma at the end, otherwise we'll have a syntax error. So if we were to diff our code at this point, we would see that we didn't just change one line of code, we changed two. With trailing commas, we could have just changed one line. No matter whether you're adding it to the middle or the end of a data structure with trailing commas, you don't need to worry about the neighboring lines of code. One really good reason to use trailing commas, if you're not convinced at this point, is that they also help avoid a very common Python gotcha. We have a list of strings here that's not using a trailing comma. Let's move apple to the beginning of this list. We did it. We're done at this point, right? According to Python, we are. According to Python, we have a perfectly valid list, but the first element is apple blueberry, which is not what we were looking for. Python is using something here called implicit string concatenation. If two string literals are sitting next to each other in Python, Python will concatenate them for you automatically as if they had a plus between them. This is a feature that's also a bug waiting to happen. So if we'd been using a trailing comma and we swapped these two lines of code, we wouldn't have been bit by implicit string concatenation. When breaking a data structure or a function call over multiple lines in Python, I recommend using a trailing comma. Trailing commas make for easier code changes, shorter diffs, and fewer bugs.